everything is online. So if you like this book, I bet you could access some of it online in read alouds, so History Smashers. After I read for about 15 minutes, then we will go to breakout rooms and work on our writing on the American Revolution. The goal is that today you write your introduction. So you have a hook and you talk about what it is you're talking about. For example, in my case, I'm talking about a famous person. So I'm going to have a hook. I'm going to say, like, have you ever really thought about the people who got independence from England so that our country could be the country that it is today? Well, one of those people I've learned is called Agent 355. She was a really important person in the American Revolution. And, you know, that's my whole introduction right there. Just a hook and then your thesis statement or your controlling idea, which is what you're basically writing about. If you're writing about allies, you're going to say something like, you know, you might think that America did it all on its own, but it turns out that our allies had a lot to do with us getting independence from England. Read on and you'll learn how France had a big role in America's independence, or something like that, if you're writing about allies. If you're writing about women, something similar, like a question, or you've heard about John Adams, you've heard about George Washington, but have you ever heard of the women who were behind the American victory against Britain in the Revolutionary War? Something like that. So we're all going to be writing our introductions today, writing our first paragraph tomorrow, second paragraph on Wednesday, third paragraph on Thursday, conclusion on Friday. By the end of the week, you should have your rough draft of your story written. So if you don't have it written yet, that's okay, because we're really starting the writing today. Here we go with History Smashers, the American Revolution. Chapter 1, ready to smash some history? Good, because the true narrative of the American Revolution is a lot more complicated than the myths. It is a story of flawed heroes, villains who were sometimes heroic. I'm going to spotlight my video. And unsung warriors whose names have been erased from history books. And it's the story of a nation that's still remaking itself even today. Chapter 1, War of Words. When Americans celebrate with cookouts and fireworks on the 4th of July, the story of Independence Day often begins and ends with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the document that declared the colonies would be free of British rule. But the truth is that document wasn't signed on July 4th, and it wasn't the beginning of American independence at all, not by a long shot. To understand the real roots of the American Revolution, you have to go way back to when the English colonies were first settled. In the 1600s, colonists arrived by the boatload. They built homes and farms on the traditional lands of Native people or American Indians from more than 24 tribal nations. So the land colonists sometimes called the New World wasn't new at all. And here's the New World crossed out. The 13 original colonies were given English names like Virginia, New Jersey, Maryland, but the original inhabitants of the land were the Abenaki, Algonquin, Assateague, Chautauqua, Cherokee, Kanoi, Creek, Hatteras, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Massachusetts, Mi'kmaq, Mohegan, Nanticoke, Narragansett, Nauset, Nipmuc, Pennacook, Pequot, Powhatan, Shawnee, Susquehannock, Wampanoag, and the Yamasee. So those were the original place names. And some of those names still exist today. You might have heard Massachusetts. That's a Native American word. These were tribal nations whose people had lived on the continent for thousands of years. That didn't stop the colonists from moving in and claiming the land and everything on it as theirs. Colonists were expected to gather up natural resources such as fur, timber, and fish and send it all back to England. As you can imagine, Native people were upset that their traditional homelands were being invaded by Europeans who saw natural resources as something to grab and sell instead of gifts from the Creator to share. There were conflicts, and England sent soldiers to protect the colonists from the people whose lands they'd stolen. To make matters worse, England was also fighting with France. War broke out in the colonies in 1754. It was actually a global conflict with fighting in Europe, the Caribbean, and India too. In America, this conflict was called the French and Indian War, since most native tribes sided with the French. England eventually won the war, which is why most people in the US still speak English and not French today. but ended up buried under a huge pile of debt. That means they owed a lot of money. They had to come up with a way to make money. It had been so expensive to send all those soldiers across the ocean. England thought it was only fair that the colonists help pay for it. So the British Parliament passed a whole bunch of new laws or acts. Some taxed the colonists, collecting money from them to help pay for all those soldiers who had defended them. So if you've heard about the Stamp Acts or the taxes, these are what the Americans were upset about. Some aimed to raise money in other ways. Those laws started even before the French and Indian War. So here's a whole bunch of the taxes. Quartering Act, Navigation Act, Molasses Act, Currency Act, Stamp Act, Sugar Act. These were all the taxes on the American colonists to try to pay for the British wars. The Molasses Act of 1733 put a tax on molasses, sugar, and rum that came from non-British colonies. The colonists didn't like this, but many got around it by smuggling or sneaking the goods without paying the tax. England responded by setting up special offices to keep an eye out for smugglers. The Molasses Act was one of the group of laws called the Navigation Acts, which aimed to control trade in the colony. None of them were popular with the colonists who preferred to not have rules about buying and selling goods. After the French and Indian War, there were even more new laws. The colonists were not happy. And here it talks about several of the laws: the Sugar Act, controlling sugar, the Currency Act, controlling the money, saying that they couldn't make their own money in the United States. The Stamp Act was taxes on all kinds of paper. The Quartering Act required you to take in the British soldiers and let them eat your food and sleep in your beds, and you had to wash their clothes and take care of them. In response to all these new laws, colonists started talking about some new ideas of their own. Representatives from 9 of the colonies got together in New York for the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 and passed a bunch of resolutions to protest. Their rallying cry was no taxation without representation. They wanted to be able to vote on the laws that were passed in England. Colonists argued that they couldn't be taxed by a government more than 3,000 miles away, only by their own governments. Not to be outdone, England responded by passing another new law called the Declaratory Act. Be declared that the said colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be subordinate. That means they have to do what we say, and dependent upon the imperial crown and parliament of Great Britain and King George. In other words, the colonists have to do what England says. And those resolutions the colonists passed don't count at all. They don't have any of their own freedom to make their own rules. It wasn't long before England dropped even more taxes on the colonists with the Townshend revenue. This was a tax on paint, oil, lead, paper, tea. The colonists now were furious. Tension boiled over the following summer when British officers seized the Liberty, a ship owned by Boston merchant John Hancock, because they said he was smuggling wine. Colonists were so angry they showed up in a mob at the customs office. That led England to send troops to occupy Boston in the fall, and we saw that when we watched that cartoon. The colonists fired back by setting up something called a non-importation agreement. It agreed not to buy anything from England. So which group had the most support? For a long time, the colonists were pretty much equally divided between the ones who wanted to stay with England and the ones who wanted to make an independent country. But John Adams was not really talking about supporting for the American Revolution at that point. They hadn't really come up with that idea. The idea for revolution started in France in 1789. Today, historians believe that overall, it's more likely that the loyalists made up about 20% of the population and about 40% were patriots, wanted independence, and 20% just didn't want any trouble. All right. There's kind of a funny article here about John Adams. I know Anna is studying John Adams. It says more than 30 years before he'd become America's second president, John Adams was one of the most outspoken critics of the English king. In 1763, he wrote a letter to the Boston Evening Post newspaper, but didn't sign it with his own name. Instead, he wrote under a fake name, Humphrey Plowjogger. He used incorrect spelling so people would think he was an uneducated farmer, and he wrote, "The great men do nothing but quarrel with one another and put pieces in the newspaper against one another. And some says it is a right and some says it is a right, but I don't know why." Anyway, at that point, everything was ready. It was ripe for a conflict. So this is what set us up for the American Revolution. We'll read more about it. And you can see here is the start of some of the violence in Boston. That'll be the next part we're going to read. And the story of Crispus Attucks, who was killed at the Boston Massacre, which we've read a little bit about, where they started throwing things at the soldiers and it got out of hand. And finally, the soldiers fired and some people were killed. And then the colonists used that, the patriots used that to try to turn the tide of emotion toward independence from England. All right, more on History Smashers tomorrow.